Welcome to everyone who's currently joined the call. We will be starting our program in just about 1 minute. We'll just give it a few more seconds for folks to join our session. Thanks so much for joining. We'll be back soon. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's briefing, Criminal Justice After the Pandemic. Today, you'll hear from members of the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice on their work and their recommendations for policymakers as they continue to address the pandemic. I'm Abby Walsh. In addition to managing the commission, I'm a vice president here at the Council on Criminal Justice. Before we begin our program, just a few notes. We are joined today by hundreds of participants, including policymakers, the public, and the media. To ensure a quality experience for everyone, all lines will be muted. But we want to hear from you. So throughout today's session, you can submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can also join the conversation on Twitter at Council on CJ. We will take as many of your questions as possible at the end of today's session. If this is your first council event, welcome. The council is an independent, nonpartisan think tank and leadership association that serves as a center of gravity for the criminal justice field. Through our task forces, research initiatives, and events, we provide policymakers, practitioners, and the public with evidence-based analysis and recommendations to address the most pressing criminal justice issues of the day. It is hard to imagine an issue more pressing to our field than the coronavirus, which quickly infiltrated the criminal justice system after arriving in the United States around the start of 2020. The council quickly called upon the nation's top experts, from former U.S. attorneys general to state corrections leaders to formerly incarcerated activists to public health scientists to meet this critical need. Since last July, the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice has worked tirelessly to assess the true impact of COVID-19 upon our system, access to justice, and the communities most impacted by criminal justice policy, to provide immediate guidance to contain the spread of COVID-19 within our prisons, jails, courts, and communities, and to guide policymakers on building a more resilient system. For this work to be effective, the commissioners needed to work quickly but thoroughly to assess the evidence and craft actionable solutions for the field. Thankfully, the work was co-chaired by two former U.S. attorneys general, Alberto Gonzales and Loretta Lynch. The first time to our knowledge that AGs from differing parties have partnered shoulder to shoulder on such an effort. Under their leadership, the commission produced more than a dozen expert analyses of critical questions in COVID-19 and criminal justice, and two authoritative reports to guide the path forward. Judge Gonzalez hoped to join us for today's event, but was called away due to an urgent family matter. So while we send him our thoughts and our thanks for his commitment to this effort, we're delighted to welcome the commission's co-chair. Loretta Lynch served as the 83rd U.S. Attorney General from 2015 to 2017, after twice serving as U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York. She has also served on the board of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and as special counsel to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. General Lynch is now a partner with Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, LLP. General Lynch, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Abby. And thanks to all of our congressional leaders for appearing with us today. And most importantly, thanks to all of you who've come together to discuss this important issue and shed light on the recommendations made by the Commission. A little over 1 year ago today, the world stopped as we sought to mitigate and to contain an unseen enemy born to us on the very air that we breathed. Now, it soon became clear that this microscopic virus posed significant challenges to all aspects of life, but particularly to our criminal justice system, the system by which we guarantee the essential safety of all of our communities. Now, almost 1 year ago, the Commission set out on its mission to assess the impact of COVID-19, to identify concrete measures to stop the spread of the virus and to produce an agenda of policy changes to better balance public health and public safety. Now, along the way, the Commission has produced numerous reports and studies, but the most important of these were our final recommendations for policy action that we released back in December. Now, since then, we have been sharing these recommendations with groups across the country. We are so pleased to be able to speak with all of you about them today. Now, we Commission members believe that we can take the lessons learned during this pandemic to help reshape our criminal justice system and into one that is both more fair, more efficient, and more effective, one that is indeed more just. We need to use the knowledge that we've gained, not just to address the crisis before us, but to prepare for future crises as well, and also to take this unique opportunity to remedy problems that have plagued the administration of justice in this country for some time. Now, the recommendations that you'll hear about in a moment reflect this imperative. They reflect this urgency. They were approved unanimously by the commissioners. They rest upon a foundation of facts, data, and the professional and personal experiences of those who battle coronavirus literally on the front lines. Now, we believe that these recommendations are ambitious, yet eminently achievable. Now, while we are realistic about the challenges ahead, we are also optimistic. The worst of the pandemic is hopefully behind us, although it has left us all with painful memories and a deep and abiding sense of loss. To honor those that we have lost, we need to take action to ensure that we are never caught unprepared again. My hope is that we will take advantage of this moment to ensure that our post-pandemic justice systems and institutions can better produce health, safety, and most importantly, justice for us all. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, General Lynch. We look forward to hearing more from you and your colleagues on the Commission shortly. Next, we welcome members of Congress to share their view. We'll begin with a message from Senator John Cornyn, who has represented Texas since 2002 and serves on the Finance, Intelligence, and Judiciary committees. Senator Cornyn has brought conservative principles to negotiations over key criminal justice legislation, including the recently passed First Step Act.
Hi, I'm Texas Senator John Cornyn. I want to wish a warm welcome to all of you joining us today to continue the conversation about what we can do to improve our criminal justice system. I'm proud of what we achieved with the First Step Act, but like the bill says, that's just the first step. I look forward to seeing what ideas today's discussion yields with some of the best and brightest minds here with us today. I have no doubt we can solve this growing challenge. Thank you for allowing me to speak with you today, and keep up the great work.
We send our thanks to Senator Cornyn for his words. And now we welcome Representative Bobby Scott, who has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District since 1993. He currently serves as chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor. Representative Scott is a leading national advocate for criminal justice reform. Welcome, sir.
Well, thank you very much, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here and to discuss issues presented by the Council on Criminal Justice, and to discuss the findings and recommendations of the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice. This discussion comes at an inflection point in our democracy. We're hopefully nearing the end of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, and that pandemic has revealed, unfortunately, inequities in our society that go back to our founding. The pandemic has laid bare shortcomings in healthcare, education, employment, policing, housing, but it is clearly revealed inequities in our criminal justice system. All too often, those caught up in our criminal justice system are left behind and rarely have anyone to advocate for them. The failed policies on the tough on crime era that led us to become the largest incarcerator in the world are slowly being rejected, but campaigns based on slogans and sound bites are still around. On criminal justice policy, we have a choice. We can follow the evidence and research and reduce crime, increase public safety, and save money that can be used for education, job training, healthcare, and other initiatives that will actually reduce crime, or we can follow poll-tested sound bites that'll do nothing about crime, waste money, and lead to mass incarceration. That mass incarceration contributed to the failure to combat the spread of COVID-19 in jails and prisons. Over 47,000 incarcerated individuals in the 125 of the 125,000 in BOP managed facilities have tested positive for COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. 226 inmates, federal inmates, have died. The Trump administration did not have any national testing strategy, and local sheriffs and prison officials were unable to test and quarantine newly arrested individuals, and so prison transfers still occurred. The result was soaring infection rates within the prison facilities, leading to virus hotspots in surrounding communities. In March of 2020, Congress passed the Bipartisan CARES Act, which significantly expanded Bureau of Prisons' discretion to grant individuals home confinement in order to reduce overcrowding and slow the spread of COVID-19. Unfortunately, the leadership of the prisons did not use all of that expanded power sufficiently to get enough inmates out of prisons to get the infection under control. Now, I sent a letter along with about 25 other members to the CDC and the Bureau of Prisons, imploring these agencies to prioritize vaccinations for incarcerated individuals because the virus was still spreading 4 times faster in prisons than in the general public. And we also advocated that these individuals be given priority in state institutions. When you have known concentration of infections, you are endangering our communities, and prisoners come in and out of prisons and jails. Guards leave the prison, they take public transportation, they visit our stores. If we do not control the infections in prisons, we are endangering the surrounding communities. Regrettably, slogans and sound bites have led the conversation in some areas, and some, although experts have said you've got to deal with the prisons if you're going to get the pandemic under control, some governors just refuse to prioritize prisoners solely for political reasons. Now, one of the things that we need to do, one of the things I'm going to be doing is reintroducing the Safe Justice Act, which will prioritize prevention, early intervention, and other initiatives to reduce mass incarceration, and the Supporting Positive Outcomes After Relief Act, which will allow inmates to keep their Medicaid coverage throughout. They won't use it while they're in prison, but they still have it when they're out, to avoid a gap in coverage when they're released. Now, with the incarceration rate we have today, we could easily employ another strategy, and that is focus on prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation to reduce crime and save money. But I think that's probably a discussion for another day. But I want to thank you for having me here today, and thank the Council on Criminal Justice and all of those joining today's briefing and helping lead the charge in reforming our criminal justice system and using evidence and research to actually reduce crime, save money, and effectively deal with the pandemic. So thank you, Abby, and as they say, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you so much, Representative Scott. Next, we welcome Representative Hakeem Jeffries, who has represented New York's 8th Congressional District since 2013. He currently serves as a member of the House Judiciary Committee and House Budget Committee. He is also the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus. Representative Jeffries, welcome.
Thank you so much, Abby, for extending this invitation and for helping to lead the effort along with the Council on Criminal Justice. in such an important area as it relates to the way forward. I want to thank General Lynch, of course, for her extraordinary leadership, along with General Gonzalez and my colleagues in government, the great Sheila Jackson Lee and Chairman Extraordinaire Bobby Scott, both of whom are incredible voices on criminal justice reform. 50 years ago this month, the failed war on drugs was launched by Richard Nixon when he issued an executive order declaring drug abuse public enemy number one. We know that at the time there were less than 300,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, 2.3 million, disproportionately Black and Latino, many, of course, who have been incarcerated over the years for nonviolent drug offenses, all of whom almost are living in inhumane conditions. That was the circumstance prior to the pandemic. And we know that the pandemic has exacerbated these conditions, a once in a lifetime crisis that is both a public health crisis and an economic crisis. And we know that the least, the lost, and the left behind, whenever crisis strikes America, are always the ones to be most adversely impacted, as CCJ has documented in the context of incarcerated individuals. Now, we've made progress over the last several years in Washington in trying to reform our criminal justice system in a forward-looking, progressive, and compassionate way. The First Step Act was a substantial step in the right direction, but lays the foundation to do much more. As I know, Sheila Jackson Lee, the chair of the crime subcommittee, and Representative Scott will be pushing as we move forward. A prison sentence should not be a death sentence. But for far too many people, that in fact was the case because of the manner in which we were unprepared to deal with a pandemic generally and within the context of incarcerated individuals held in close quarters in conditions that prior to the pandemic, many of us would describe as inhumane to begin with. So President Biden has said appropriately, we are going to build back better. And that should mean everywhere, including within our criminal justice system. And we look forward to partnering with CCJ in that effort. And I'm confident that together at this moment, with this leadership, we can make tremendous progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative. Finally, please welcome Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who has represented the 18th Congressional District of Texas since 1995. She serves as the chair of the Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security of the House Judiciary Committee, and she also serves on the Homeland Security and Budget Committees. Representative Jackson Lee is a leading national advocate for criminal justice reform. Representative Jackson Lee, welcome.
Thank you so very much for having me today. And it is certainly my pleasure to join you, Abby, on the Council on Criminal Justice, and as well to join my colleagues, Senator Cornyn, Chairman Scott, and Chairman Jeffries for this important meeting, and to the conveners, General Lynch and General Gonzalez. We thank them very much for their service and their interest. I wanted to share from the very beginning, as I open my remarks, some numbers. And as I do so, let me indicate the importance of this work. And of course, to acknowledge the Director of Corrections for Oregon, Colette, who will also be talking about criminal justice. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted and exacerbated many of the inequities in our criminal justice system, such as the pervasive racial and ethnic disparities. As you all know, I have been working on these issues for many years, and I redoubled my efforts when we saw that the pandemic was tearing through prisons and jails. In particular, in my own community, it was evident that the pandemic was racing through our local jail. And in addition, it was attacking our jailers. individuals who were responsible for maintaining those who are incarcerated. Let me emphasize that those in the jail system, the county jail systems, the local jails, are usually persons who could not bond out, are usually persons who are waiting on trial, and are usually persons who have not been convicted. Tragically, jailers died and inmates died. And the inability to access testing was in fact shameful. So in one of my constituent outreach, I worked to bring testing to the jail and to secure through the CARES Act a medical provider that would go outside of the normal county structure, volunteer themselves to enter the jail and work with the county medical team in the jail to be able to provide those resources. Should that be the way that we handle that, I was willing to do so, but I don't think that should be the process. So let me just give you those statistics that I indicated that I was going to offer this morning. And that is, since March 2020, around the start of the pandemic, BOP received 30,969 compassionate release requests, of which only 0.1 have been approved. Over 45,000 people incarcerated in federal facilities have contracted COVID-19, and at least 236 of them have died. As you all know, this is, again, if I use my term, shameful. While COVID-19 infection rates are declining across the country because of increasing vaccination rates, our criminal justice system remains vulnerable to outbreaks, and it really has not caught up. We must continue to take steps to protect incarcerated individuals, as well as correctional staff, by increasing vaccination rates of both staff and incarcerated people, and by reducing mass incarceration. We've learned a great deal from the struggles of the past. To that end, my committee will be holding a sentencing hearing and will be working to eliminate mandatory minimums. We've seen the damage that they've occurred over the years. In addition, I have introduced legislation dealing with good time early relief, which builds upon the work that we have been focused on over the years, and certainly adds to the very fine work of Chairman Jeffries on the First Step Act. All of us know that it was a very important initiative, and all of us know that the previous administration did not do well by enforcing or working to help the BOP, the Bureau of Prison, to implement the First Step Act. We continue to work on that as we go forward. As the chair of the Judiciary Subcommittee on Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security, I will continue to engage my colleagues to draw upon these lessons learned as we in Congress seek to make reforms to our criminal justice system. As I indicated, a sentencing commission hearing, eliminating mandatory minimums, dealing with the elderly and those who are most sick, and of course, making sure that the Bureau of Prison is consistent in implementing those provisions that have been introduced. Frankly, the last administration interfered with the Bureau of Prison in terms of changing the rules on compassionate release. That, of course, created a health crisis by keeping sicker inmates incarcerated and creating a danger for those who were the corrections officers and other inmates as well. And so as the pandemic shed a light, we must capture this opportunity to make well-informed and necessary changes. We're going to do that in my subcommittee. Therefore, I look forward to hearing from the esteemed panelists about the commission's findings and recommendations and how I can be a partner to you as we seek to improve our system going forward. I know the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Nadeau, who works very closely with me on these criminal justice issues and overall on the committee leadership, will be welcoming of the findings as well. Thank you to the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice, particularly Attorneys General Gonzalez, Lynch, for spearheading the commission and examining the important issue. One note that I want to offer: legislation can make a difference, but once it is passed, it must be implemented, it must be enforced. Soon, in the last couple of days, we've introduced the MORE Act, which hopefully will take an added burden off the criminal justice system dealing with the criminalization of marijuana. All of these play to how do you deal with the sickest, the sick, and those who can find another relief for incarceration because of their condition. We in Congress, along with my distinguished colleague here, Representative Scott, Jeffries, Cornyn, look forward to doing our part to address the adverse impacts on our criminal justice system after the COVID-19 pandemic, but to be prepared for any pandemic or crisis to come. Thank you very much for having me, Abby, and I look forward to hearing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Representative, and all members who joined us today. We truly appreciate your dedication to this issue and your words. With that, I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Thomas Apt, Council Senior Fellow and Director of the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Abby, and thanks to all the members who just spoke, and thanks to all of you for being here with us today. As you heard from General Lynch, the Commission released recommendations and a report in December detailing what the criminal justice system should do and look like in a post-pandemic world. I'm going to briefly summarize those findings and recommendations, and then we're going to get to the question and answer period as soon as possible. So the Commission outlined 5 major findings and recommendations. The first finding, as several members highlighted, and shouldn't be surprising to anyone in the audience, is that criminal justice agencies were simply not sufficiently prepared for a large-scale public health crisis like the coronavirus pandemic. Many criminal justice organizations and institutions prepare for emergencies, but not for protracted emergencies like the one we faced with the pandemic. As a result of this lack of preparedness, the Commission recommended engaging all sectors of the system, especially public health authorities and community-based organizations, in doing integrated crisis response plans. This includes establishing coordinating panels for public health preparedness, upgrading the technological infrastructure of the criminal justice system, building out community-based capacity to support justice-involved populations during public health emergencies, and importantly, prioritizing those who are incarcerated or working within correctional facilities for early access to vaccines and personal protective equipment. Our second recommendation, the second Commission finding, concerned the sheer scale and scope of the criminal justice system, along with the absence of public health coordination, and how that posed a significant obstacle to controlling COVID-19. In response, the Commission recommended ambitiously rebalancing the criminal justice and public health responses in our country in order to limit contact, maximize distance, and reduce density. There were a series of specific recommendations that you can read in our final report, such as expanding compassionate medical and emergency release mechanisms to permit the medically vulnerable to petition for release, and investing in evidence-based public health alternatives to traditional law enforcement, particularly for public health behavioral issues, ensuring adequate access to behavioral health treatment, medical care, and stable housing for those returning from incarceration, and for lawmakers to consider the longest criminal sentences and their impact on public health and public safety. Third, the Commission found inconsistency and a wide diversity among criminal justice jurisdictions in their responses to the coronavirus pandemic. And as a result of this as a result of this largely ad hoc response, differing greatly from state to state, city to city, county to county, the Commission is encouraging the adoption of shared standards and best practices for responding to public health emergencies like the coronavirus pandemic. And I think it's important to note here that this is not just backward looking at the coronavirus pandemic specifically, but public health emergencies in the future. As Representative Jackson Lee said, it's not enough to look backwards and acknowledge what went wrong. We need to look forward to make sure that it never happens again. So some of the specific recommendations in this area included best practices concerning issuing citations in lieu of arrests when public safety isn't jeopardized, identifying which court proceedings are appropriate for video conference consistent with constitutional rights, and mandating national basic standards of care for correctional healthcare operations, and developing strategies to ensure compliance. The fourth finding concerned the lack of relevant, trustworthy, and comparable data. And we can say that the commission members and the staff found this to be a major obstacle in properly diagnosing what was going on with the pandemic and then offering treatments and solutions moving forward. Data may sound like a dry, abstract issue, but in the modern world, you're really only as good as your data. The commission consequently strongly recommended collecting and transparently reporting standardized aggregated public health data concerning justice-involved populations and staff. Now, specifically with regard to the coronavirus pandemic, we recommended that agencies should report on COVID-19 case, testing, positivity, hospitalization, and mortality rates, and breaking that reporting down by age, gender, race, and ethnicity. Agencies should document and report on how public health emergencies have impacted their activities and operations. And federal research agencies, very importantly, should develop a new data architecture for public health information and fund a national research agenda. Fifth and finally, the commission found a lack of communication and transparency significantly hampered criminal justice responses to the pandemic. And so the commission believes strongly that we need to improve the communication and increase transparency concerning public health in the criminal justice system by developing reliable channels of communication. Now, this won't happen by accident, and it has to be done with great intentionality. So the commission recommended specific items such as establishing liaisons in criminal justice agencies to facilitate the flow of public health information, creating additional channels of communication between correctional facilities, people in custody, their families, and their counsel. And importantly, partnering with and equipping community-based organizations to better engage vulnerable populations. This is just a brief summary of the Commission's findings and recommendations. And of course, you can find more about this on our website. Now I want to turn to the Commission members themselves so that you can hear directly from them. General Loretta Lynch has already been introduced, and we're so pleased to have her here. We're also joined by Justice Tina Nadeau and Director Colette Peters. Justice Nadeau has served as the Chief Justice of the New Hampshire Superior Court since 2011. Prior to that, she was an Associate Justice, served as legal counsel to a governor, and as an Assistant Attorney General. Director Peters has led the Oregon Department of Corrections since 2012. She has a national reputation for using data to improve outcomes for people in custody, increase agency efficiency and effectiveness, and promote staff wellness. Prior to becoming director, Peters ran the Oregon Youth Authority and served as a prison inspector general and victims advocate. General Lynch, I'd like to begin with you. In the Commission's recommendations, the Commission noted that compassionate and medical release policies are currently available, yet rarely used. There's a recent bill out, the COVID-19 Safer Detention Act, that was introduced to expand eligibility for the federal elderly home detention pilot program and to add COVID-19 as the basis for compassionate release. But more broadly, should release policies be expanded and expedited, especially with regard to the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Thomas, for focusing on this important area. And let me also thank the members of Congress who've spoken today and all of those who are working on this very issue. I'm so glad that that's a topic that Congress is studying and taking up. You know, one of the things that we're trying to focus on here with these recommendations is literally what can we learn from this experience that we have all trudged through, literally. And so I think what we see is that compassionate release programs do exist, but because we did not have such a widespread need for them, they were strained to their limits. So they were rarely used before, which meant that people were not familiar, either the applicants nor those who are reviewing them. So we've learned that it will be incredibly helpful to have, for example, some clear standards for compassionate release. We can look at the COVID-19 experience and draw from that on these standards. We can also look at what's been happening with those who've been released recently and how well most of them have done in terms of their reentry back into society as we look to set these standards also. And certainly I know that the commission staff stands ready to assist Congress with any data or information that it needs, but certainly we feel that an expansion of the compassionate release program, along with greater transparency about how to apply, greater transparency even for those who are implementing the program into which standards they should use, would help everyone in this system.
Thank you, General. Justice Nadeau, courts had to react rapidly to the pandemic, and one key response was the use of video conferencing to hold certain court proceedings remotely. Now, as the pandemic wanes, should courts keep these and other technological innovations in place?
Thank you, Thomas, for that excellent question. Yes, courts had to pivot pretty quickly from regular court sessions to a technique that would help them guarantee access to justice. So we were constantly balancing, how do we make sure folks have their day in court, and at the same time, how are we protecting people from this deadly pandemic? And from my perspective, many hearings can continue to be held remotely. And we need to balance, obviously, every good idea has some pros and cons. And remote technology has a lot of benefits. First of all, to people who are working, to people who are having to drive long distances to courts. They want to have access to justice pretty easily. So there are a lot of hearings, simple hearings like scheduling hearings, even some uncontested plea hearings that we can conduct remotely while allowing people to be able to be fully engaged at work. We know a lot of people struggle with transportation to courts. So this technology helps us keep access to justice going. Now, not every single case type or not every single proceeding should be conducted remotely. We have concerns about jury trials. How are jurors paying attention to the case? Are they engaging with someone else at home to talk about the facts of the case? So we have to be very careful about what types of hearings we want to keep conducting remotely. And we also know that there is some data that shows that remote hearings, for example, during a bail hearing, actually results in increased cash bail being set. So we want to be careful that we aren't building in this sort of ability to have no empathy. If you're conversing with somebody online, it's a little bit easier to be removed from them. So do we want to make sure that we're identifying the cases where that empathy can continue to sustain? On the other hand, might we want judges to be able to see how a defendant is living and working and what their family life is like? Might that be an opportunity to build empathy? So as you've said before, the important thing is to maintain data on how our remote access is providing access to justice and what is it actually doing? Is it increasing concerns? Is it opening up access to justice? And what we should be doing is accepting and incorporating the best of this technology innovation and also continue to study its effects on access to justice to make sure that we are always striving to enhance access. So I think we can benefit a lot from the challenges that we faced in the pandemic and using remote access. And we also need to pay attention that we're using it for the right hearings.
Such great points, Justice Nadeau. I think this is also true of various reporting requirements in community corrections, such as probation and parole. And I also think that your point about access is very important. It's as we press forward with technological innovation, it's important that carries us all forward and doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities in the system. Right. So thank you for that answer. Director Peters, Oregon's Cascadia response plan is featured in the Commission's recommendations. If you could, please tell us about the importance of robust emergency planning and how the federal government could support state and local planning looking forward.
Thank you, Thomas. Appreciate the question and appreciate the amazing work of the Council on Criminal Justice over these few months. Yes, in great part, we were prepared because we had planned for the massive earthquake that's supposed to occur in our lifetime in the Cascadia subduction zone, resulting in massive destruction, mass loss of life. And so in preparing for that, we had a continuity of operations plan that allowed us to be prepared to operate with half of our employees and half of our institutions available for those adults in custody. And that planning wasn't just a paper document. We practiced, we tweaked, we planned some more. And while our response to the pandemic was not perfect, I do believe that this preparation really helped us get out in front. But we learned a lot. We started with a great bridge between public safety and the Oregon Health Authority, but the bridge wasn't thick enough and it wasn't wide enough. And so those relationships really grew in the midst of this pandemic. Where we were really lacking in that relationship was the local public health authorities. And so we really had to think quickly on our feet to build those relationships in the midst of this pandemic. The other thing that the planning helped us understand was the National Incident Command Structure. So we knew as an agency exactly who was in charge, who had to be making which decisions and when, who shouldn't be making decisions at certain times. And the state had begun planning with all state agencies on the incident command structure, but we were lacking. Public safety was prepared and very thoroughly understood the training, but where I think we could receive more guidance from the federal government is helping us train all state agencies in the incident command structure going forward.
Thank you, Director. General Lynch, I'd like to come back to you. As noted in the findings of the commission, there was this wide disparity in responses to the pandemic. Reactions varied greatly jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some performed well, and candidly, some didn't perform well. Looking ahead, what do you see is the federal role for providing consistent guidance to state and local criminal justice institutions when they're responding to public health crises like the pandemic?
Certainly, that's an excellent point. And you're so right. The challenge was so broad and so overwhelming. And let me just be clear that in discussing this issue, this is not to lay blame or criticize those departments and agencies and localities that were literally just truly struggling with this. Everyone put their shoulder to the wheel. But what we saw was that while some people, as the discussion about the Oregon preparedness situation showed, some people already had a framework that they could turn to and use and apply to the COVID-19 disaster, and then recognize the remaining gaps there. And many jurisdictions just did not have that existing framework. And more to the point, they did not know where to go to actually get assistance. They did not know, what municipality in my state actually has a plan, either preparedness that covers pandemic or pandemic in general. They didn't know where to go. And so the federal government's role here can be crucial and can be very helpful. The first thing the federal government can do is work to identify the best practices that were developed across the country. People are sharing them very organically now, but there certainly can be convenings. And one of the important powers the federal government has, particularly in the area of law enforcement and criminal justice, is the power to convene experts and people who have been through challenging situations. And that's often where the best ideas come from. It's not, with all due respect to those who are focused on this issue in Washington, it's often not people sitting in Washington pondering the issue. It's people who've lived through it on the ground. And people have lived and sadly died through it at this point. So the federal government can identify the best practices. We now have databases. We can look at areas and see what are the public safety impacts of, for example, reducing arrests during a pandemic. One of the most important things law enforcement on the ground was try to have fewer specific direct contacts between the police and citizens. And so, for example, low-level offenses, let's use a citation or a ticket as opposed to an arrest, and putting that person through the system, thereby increasing the COVID risk for everyone. So we now have the data that shows us that was actually a fairly effective tool. So we can use that data to scale up to larger programs. The federal government can also, once they identify these best practices and things that did work, Look at the diversion programs that were set up, again, to shunt people away from incarceration. And now that we have better data, we have many more jurisdictions forced to engage in these programs. Let's look at the ones that had the best results. The federal government can incentivize the state and local jurisdictions, both through direct funding, that's always welcome, but most importantly through technical assistance. And certainly in many areas, I know the Department of Justice has a number of strong programs that provide expert guidance, that provide consultation and advice to jurisdictions who want to be connected to others that are facing this area. And finally, that connectivity as well. You know, connecting jurisdictions who have faced this issue with others is frankly something that the federal government is well suited to do. So information sharing, training, technical assistance, direct funding, but also let me just say the federal government can also be a leader in this area on its own. Certainly the lessons learned throughout the criminal justice system were learned in federal courts and in the federal correctional system as well. We know what worked, we know what didn't work. And we learned that at a tremendous cost. So let's not let that cost be something that we just write off. Let's use it and honor the losses that we suffered to essentially work on the standards and tactics and issues that were shown to be effective. So the federal government has an incredibly important role to play in this.
Thank you, General. Such great points. I completely agree that the federal system could be a model for state and local systems if we, take account for these hard lessons learned. And I have to agree with you. During my time in the Justice Department, training and technical assistance was some of the best spent dollars that we invested. So thank you for that. Justice Nadeau, I want to follow up on this issue. The commission recommended, in addition to scaling back some criminal justice responses, as the general just mentioned, scaling up public health responses. Now, what should these alternatives look like, especially in terms of behavioral issues such as mental health and substance abuse?
Yes, this is the crux of the question in my view. And I think the pandemic brought to the forefront practices that we all engage in that we really need to examine. We need to look at our firmly held beliefs. We need to figure out, are we actually engaging in responses to criminal behavior that are making people better and reducing crime and keeping the public safe? Or are we doing what we've always done? So in the beginning of the pandemic, we saw that judges were concerned about holding people on cash bail and keeping them in jail and prison where the pandemic could really ravage their lives, their families. And so they were very conscientious and intentional about who should be held pending trial and who should be released. And at the very beginning, we saw a pretty significant reduction in pretrial detention. And we did not see, at least at this point, a resulting increase in crime. So we really had a chance to say to ourselves, are we detaining people who have not yet been convicted of a crime at a higher rate than we need to? So we need to be looking at our bail practices and examining those bail practices. Do we have pretrial service release programs where we can safely monitor people in the community while they're waiting for a trial, and maybe even at that time get them engaged in substance use treatment? Because we know that people are more likely to respond to treatment when we catch them very early on, right at the moment of their arrest. Are we really enhancing public safety by setting low cash bail and as a result incarcerating poor people at a higher rate than we should be? We need to look at opportunities, as you say, to address substance use and mental health issues which drive criminal behavior. So how can we address the underlying problems so that we don't see people continuing to commit crime? I'd love to point out one example from Texas, and I'm glad to see that the senator was here today as well. In Dallas, Texas, they've developed a program called Right Care. It's a pretty new program, but it basically is one of those opportunities to take people out of the criminal justice system before they even get there. You've got a paramedic, you've got a licensed mental health clinician, you have a specifically trained police officer, you have an integrated team. Then you have a 911 operator who's also trained. So when someone calls for a mental health emergency, instead of sending the police out to make an inevitable arrest, they send this integrated care team out that can actually make some clinical assessments on the scene, including getting people hooked up with medication right away. And the early results are pretty positive. They had just over 4,000 calls in the first 18 months. Only 2% of those cases resulted in arrest. And 900 people were diverted from emergency departments, 500 diverted from jail, and many stayed engaged in treatment for a long period of time. So that's one small example. You see that example in drug courts, you see that example in mental health courts. And some of these programs exist. I think we need to look at them more robustly, and we need to be willing to expand our view of how we can deal with mental health and substance use as a public health issue and not a criminal justice issue.
Thank you, Jen. Really helpful and important comments here and answer here. Director Peters, I want to turn to you. The coronavirus pandemic, really had a devastating impact on correctional facilities in many ways. Thousands lost their lives in these both people working within the facilities and those who are incarcerated within them as well. And the system overall was impacted: law enforcement officers, court officials, and others. But there, as Representative Jackson Lee, there's been a number of news articles concerning low rates of vaccination among incarcerated individuals and even among staff working in those facilities. As you know, the commission prioritized providing access to vaccines for those working and living behind bars. How do we improve this situation and get more people vaccinated?
Thank you, Thomas. It is just so important and imperative that we continue to grow those numbers in Oregon and across the country. Vaccines work. I am pleased to report that as of last week, we have 0 adults in custody who are positive for the COVID virus right now. We, thank goodness, have not had a death in custody, COVID related, since the vaccines were rolled out. So what did we do and how did we get here? And what are we doing to continue that progress? So it's all about education and access. And thanks to the council's leadership and recommendation, and the Honorable Judge Beckerman, as well as our governor here, who did prioritize vaccines for both those in our care and custody and our employees. And we worked leading up to the rollout of the vaccines on educating the adults in custody and our employees on the science behind the vaccines. As you saw the confusion in the community around vaccinations, of course, we had the same confusion and fear inside our institutions. And so we spent a lot of time, our medical team spent a lot of time educating both our employees and the adults in custody. And then we made them available. So we began offering vaccines to our employees at the beginning of this year. Just before the end of the year, we began vaccinating those who are most vulnerable to COVID, who are in our care and custody. And to date, we can report that at a minimum, we have 50% of our employees who are vaccinated. And we know that because they receive the vaccinations at our clinics. We also know the number's higher than that because we have employees who have self-reported getting those vaccines in the community at other vaccination events, et cetera. And then our adult in custody population agreed to be vaccinated at a rate of 70% overall, and 86% of those who are considered vulnerable to the COVID virus. And again, it was about education and access. And we're continuing both, even though we're very pleased with those numbers. Those numbers are higher than even the community in Oregon. And so we're now going to offer additional clinics to both the adults in custody and our employees, starting in June for our employees. And we're offering all 3 vaccines. So if they had concerns about one vaccination, they could choose another. And we're also opening those clinics now to our employees' families and making wellness events happen around them so they can, at the same time, learn a little bit about correctional officer and correctional professionals, employee wellness, and the benefits of staying healthy. So more to come, but we're very pleased with what we've been able to accomplish here. And I hope we're able to accomplish more across this country in order to see those COVID positive numbers drop dramatically.
Thanks so much, Director Peters. And thank you, Justice Nadeau, and of course, General Lynch. It's now time to get to the audience and hear your questions for our commission members. And so with that, I'll turn back to my colleague, Abby Walsh.
Thank you, Thomas, and to all of our commissioners who have been joining us and taking Thomas's questions today. I want to remind the audience that you are welcome and encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We are going to take as many questions as we can today, but it is already busy in the Q&A box. We'll see how many we can get to. Thomas, our first question is actually to you. Recent headlines in the Commission's own analysis have highlighted some troubling trends in crime and violence in many communities. Many of our listeners and policymakers are concerned by this. Are those trends tied to the pandemic response policies? And how do we balance safeguarding public health, including the health of adults in custody, while protecting public safety? We'd love to hear your thoughts on the statistics and then hear from our panelists on how we achieve this balance.
Certainly, it's a great question. It's an important question. In January, the council released a new report on crime trends in the United States in connection with the pandemic. And it was authored by Richard Rosenfeld and myself and Ernesto Lopez. And unfortunately, what we found was a very significant spike in violent crime, especially in homicide, during 2020, And unfortunately, in a recent updated report that was released just a few weeks ago, we know those trends continued into this year. What was driving this spike? It's clearly partly the pandemic and partly other factors. In terms of the pandemic, it placed enormous strains on both the individuals at the highest risk for both committing and being victimized by violence, and on the institutions that are charged with responding and controlling violence, police, EMS, hospitals, but also very importantly, all of the community-based responses to engage those individuals at high risk, to offer them assistance and supports, to persuade them to positively change their lives. I think it's important to note that there isn't any connection that we saw in our research between releases associated with the pandemic and increased crime rates. And in fact, one of our reports documented that among a population of a sample of jail releases, that people being released during the pandemic actually had lower recidivism rates or return rates than others before the pandemic. And so I think the answer is complicated. We need to absolutely address this issue of public safety, but we can have public health and public safety at the same time.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I want to turn to our panelists to ask you the question, how do we balance safeguarding public health, including the health of adults in custody, while protecting public safety? General Lynch, do you have a perspective on this?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the question. I think we have, as Thomas has so appropriately noted, they're not mutually exclusive. I think obviously when we talk about rebalancing public health and public safety, we are talking about groups that have clearly been recognized to actually not be the main contributors to violent crime, low-level offenders, people, for example, misdemeanor offenses. And so those can still be managed in a way that safely reduces those individuals' interaction with the criminal justice system. And frankly, that actually leaves law enforcement free to focus on those who do pose a significant risk to the communities in which they live and the people in them. And what we also have to think about, though, is that the root causes of violent crime have confounded for generations. They literally have. And whenever we have these spikes in crime, we look for one cause or one reason. Was it the protests last year? Was it the pandemic? And violent crime has been with us for some time. The spikes tend to have a number of different factors. behind them. But what we have seen is that, as Thomas noted also, in addition to a robust law enforcement response, that there are a number of community-based ways of dealing with violence. There are violence interrupter programs in different cities. There are ways to try and intervene early on with individuals who are at high risk for certain types of violent crime. There certainly have been intervention programs. And by this, I mean like law enforcement engaging with individuals whom data can show or can tell us seem to be on that path and trying to intercept them from going further down the path. And so we need to scale up programs like that. We need to view this as a multifaceted issue and have more than one response to it. But it should not, but our concern about the rise in violent crime, which obviously we have to be concerned about, should not stand in the way of us adopting effective pandemic responses and also using the lessons learned from this pandemic, that the majority of people who are entering the criminal justice system are not those that are committing the most violent crimes, and that we need to have different methods for dealing with different types of offenders. The best law enforcement recognize this, and they will tell you that there are different ways of dealing with different individuals, and particularly the issue of mental health, as we've already discussed.
Thank you so much, General Lynch. Judge Nadeau, my next question is for you. We've heard of many jurisdictions that are now facing heavy case backlogs stemming from court closures, which is resulting in many people spending longer time behind bars pre-trial or awaiting their day in court. What resources and support could help court systems get back on track as court systems begin to reopen?
Yes, that is a great question, and one that's on the mind of a lot of people who have family members that are facing crimes and people who are waiting for trials. And I think what we need to focus on are what are some techniques that we aren't using that we could be using to resolve cases early. So I think law enforcement and prosecution can take a look at their caseloads and determine, is this a case where we can resolve it right now? There are early case resolution programs where defense attorneys who are seasoned in the practice and prosecutors can get together and go through a stack of cases instead of waiting for them to churn through the system month after month. There are also now in several states criminal mediation programs where retired judges actually sit and try to mediate criminal cases in a more informal way. There are also settlement conference type arrangements where it's more of a restorative justice model, where even in cases where a defendant is incarcerated or it's a very challenging case with a victim involved, you can have the parties sit down in a uniform, sort of supported, therapeutically supported environment to resolve a case short of trial. So I think investment in resources to help us develop those short of trial type of ideas are really going to help, one, with the backlog. And also, I think another way of looking at it is these ideas are also going to help reduce recidivism more than the traditional way of doing business. So again, I come back to sort of the pandemic giving us an opportunity to examine the way we are doing things and to determine, we can keep the public safe and get cases resolved earlier if we make investment in sort of those pre-trial resolution ideas.
Thank you so much. Director Peters, our next question is for you. There's much interest from the listeners today about data sharing, data transparency, and members of Congress and advocates have expressed concerns about these issues, particularly around infection and mortality rates inside prisons and jails during the height of the pandemic. How can we do a better job of data collection and data sharing between justice and health systems without overburdening an already struggling correctional system?
I think that transparency has never been more important in the midst of a pandemic. You have loved ones, friends, and families that have not seen those who are incarcerated for over a year now. And really having the public trust that they're being cared for is a really difficult thing to do right now. And data sharing would be a key component into bridging that gap. Our systems are old. our systems are underfunded and old. And so data collection is difficult. In Oregon, our main data system is still based in COBOL programming. As just one example, we have 15,000 patients who are incarcerated, and we do not have an electronic health record system. Plus, we didn't have any national leadership and guidance on how we should be collecting this data. And so going forward, I think that is going to be really relevant and important, so that Oregon is tracking the same way Texas is tracking in terms of COVID positives, COVID deaths, and quite frankly, any data collection point going forward, so that we really can truly understand our systems and compare them side by side.
Thank you so much, Director Peters. General Lynch, many of the recommendations in this report have surfaced before the pandemic: improving technological infrastructure of the system, increasing behavioral health and mental health resources, but they didn't see much success. What makes this moment different or more likely to yield progress?
You're absolutely right, Abby, and I thank the questioner for that, because really the things that we're talking about today are things that many of us who've worked in this field have been advocating for years. And I know people on this call have recognized these issues before, but they've always been in a very episodic way, or they've been in a way that people have been able to cabin off and view as not tied to their daily lives. And look, the reality is, when we talk about issues, the issue of mass incarceration, for example, the issue of criminal justice reform, there's still people in this country who view it as an important issue, but they think, you know what, it really doesn't impact me. And there's so many other things that are clamoring for people's attention that is not part of their focus. Well, you know what? COVID came for everyone. It came for all of us. This was our plague year. And so I think this particular time is giving people the opportunity to see the interconnected nature of the impact of one virus, not only in the criminal justice system, but how the impact within that system also has affected the society. One of the previous speakers mentioned, I think Representative Scott was talking about corrections officers who not only are exposed in an institution, but then are also members of the community. Representative Jackson Lee also was making similar points about how connected we all are. This has been brought home to us in a way that it really was not before. So the challenge, the issue, the concern of someone in the system is still the concern of someone who may not be a defendant or someone who works in the system, but is impacted by what happens there. So that's, I think, one of the first things behind it. But I also think that we're at a point, we're at a national inflection point where we really are examining, what do we want to do as a country? How do we want to treat people? How do we want to connect? After a year and a half apart, how we come together is really what's defining us as a country, and how we deal with people who have been on the outside for so long, I think is becoming much more important to many people in this country. And that is making the issue more important as well. So this is an opportunity. We have been through a national disaster preparedness scenario, the kind that only happens episodically in agencies. We've all been through it now. So everyone recognizes the issues. People see it in a visceral way that they did not see before. And I think also there's a national reckoning of how do we want to treat people who have been marginalized in so many, many ways, but who frankly could be any of us on any given day. That's what I think is going to make this response more meaningful, more robust, and more substantive.
Thank you so much, General Lynch, and to all of our panelists and listeners today. We're coming up on the end of our time. We're also hopefully coming up on an inflection point in the pandemic as we see the world and communities begin to reopen while other places still struggle, as we see numbers in parts of the correctional system becoming more positive and in other places somewhat more concerning. So before we leave, I would like to ask each of our panelists, coming out of today's conversation, is there any one point or one issue that you hope that policymakers and our listeners today will carry forward coming out of today's conversation? Director Peters, I'll come to you first.
Thank you, Abby. I think there's so much. All of the recommendations in this report are so relevant and so important to carry through. So I would just say, as a member here today and as the director of the Department of Corrections, any leadership or funding that we can get going forward is going to be just so important. I think one thing we haven't talked about today is federal support in bringing together Department of Corrections, public safety officials, and health authorities. And I think if there's one thing that would help us through the recovery period, through post-recovery, and in the face of any other pandemic or natural disaster that we'll be faced with, having that coming together in that post-op, if you will, and really understand what went well, what didn't go well, and then creating those guidelines for the next events that we're faced with. I think that would be incredibly helpful. Thank you, Abby.
Thanks, Director Peters. Justice Nadeau, what do you hope that our listeners and policymakers carry forward from today's conversation?
Thanks for the question, Abby. And I think General Lynch said it really well, and that is this pandemic has taught us about the interconnectedness of everyone, not only within our criminal justice systems, but also between criminal justice and public health. And on an individual basis, every single person who walks down the street is facing the same or similar challenge as someone else. And so I'm hoping that our recommendations will be taken seriously. And I'm also hoping that our recommendations and our conversations around them will promote more empathy between people and more understanding and more willingness to listen to the other side.
Thank you so much. And General Lynch, as our co-chair, I'll come to you for the final word.
Well, thank you, Abby. And first of all, let me again thank everyone for coming together for this important discussion. In particular, I want to thank the commission staff and also my fellow commissioners who joined me here today. I hope that everyone has seen just from this brief discussion with Judge Nadeau and Director Peters, the depth of talent that we were so privileged to work with on these issues. I guess my hope is that as we look at this, we realize that we all have choices. We chose to deal with the pandemic in a way that tried to save lives. We choose to get vaccinated. We choose to encourage our friends and family to as well. And we now have another choice. And that is, how do we look at the criminal justice system going forward? And my hope is that we choose to not look away from the tremendous trauma that we've all been through, but use it really to learn and to grow. As we touched on, these issues are not new. The pandemic highlighted existing strains and stresses on the system. It didn't expose anything new, but it really highlighted that it's all a matter of life and death, sometimes even the smallest of things. And as we all talk about the role of the federal government or how different states are doing well, throughout all of that is a need for resources. And so I hope that what we will do is choose to invest in a system of criminal justice that not only deals with accountability and deals with holding people accountable and making them responsible for their actions, but also takes into account how they got there and what's going to happen to them when they go home, and how they are coming home, frankly, to all of us. And as we build that infrastructure, we should make the choices that lead toward a fairer and more efficient and truly more just system for all. We have the tools. We have the know-how. We know what works. We've seen it over this past year, and we have paid dearly for it. Let's choose now to move forward with those lessons and invest, literally invest the funds and the resources needed to make our recommendations a reality and to uplift the work of everyone in the criminal justice system who has been operating under tremendous strain for the past year to support those who live and work in that system. So thank you again to everyone.
Thank you so much, General Lynch, and to all of our panelists. We truly appreciate your participation today and the attention of all of our listeners. The Commission's full report is available at covid19.counciloncj.org, as well as more than a dozen impact analyses on critical questions in COVID response, including the prevalence of COVID-19 in prisons and jails, its impact on domestic violence and victim services, and crime trends during the pandemic. Thank you for joining us today. We hope to see you at another Council on Criminal Justice event soon. Thanks so much.